That suddenly sounds more resonant, right? So, first of all, I just want to acknowledge the Torah carriers. That was not the planned route for the Torahs. And I'm kind of amazed that what you needed to do was make sure that everybody had a chance to be close to Torah today and just kind of go through this whole expanded space. It was actually quite wonderful. There was a moment where Rabbi Graf and I looked at each other like, should we redirect them? And then we both kind of felt, let's just follow the Torah, like they know what they're doing. So it's a good approach. Yom Kippur is a very solemn day. And I feel very grateful to be part of a community that's willing to take some time off work, to come be here and sit and fast and think about some serious questions and challenges of what it means to be us and to be alive in this era. And I feel especially blessed to be able to be a rabbi in such a serious and thoughtful community. And so I want to talk a little bit about Yom Kippur and some of the paradoxes that are inherent in it, and some of the strange things that we talk about or do over the course of the holiday. So one paradox is that Yom Kippur is in some ways a dress rehearsal for our death, even though it's all about how we live. And what I mean by that is on Yom Kippur, we refrain from eating and drinking. We refrain from anointing and some of our normal bathing rituals. We refrain from marital intimacy. And most of all, we wear white or even the shroud. My kittel is the garment in which I intend to be buried. And so it's a kind of dress rehearsal for our death, or we're acting as if, in some ways, we're already dead. And yet the purpose, every dress rehearsal means to teach you about the main event. But this dress rehearsal means to teach us or challenge us to think about how we live and the meaning of our life, to recognize that our days have significance, because what we spend this, as it were, last day of our life doing is engaging in prayer, in repairing relationships, and reminding ourselves that what we do matters. There are other choices of how we might spend the last day. For example, I happen to really like apple fritters. I may have mentioned this before. One could imagine spending the day eating an excessive amount of food or out partying. But what we do instead is say our lives matter, and we're going to join together, and we're going to be here in community and try and figure this out. That's paradox number one. There's another challenge or paradox that's inherent in Yom Kippur, which is whose job is it actually to fix the world? The liturgy is filled with examples where we say God will bring us in song and joy to a new era, that everything in the world is going to change around us, and it's going to be wonderful because of something that the Holy One does. And we say tshuva, tzedakah, tefillah, that prayer, repentance, and deeds of charity are capable of changing the nature of the world itself. The rabbis understand this paradox or this question also in one of the sources where they talk about what you're to do if the Messiah comes. You may have heard this before. If you're in the midst of planting a tree and you receive word that the Messiah has arrived, what are you supposed to do? You finish planting the tree. That is a uniquely Jewish answer. In other words, it is more important to try and change the world as it is into the world that we're trying to create than to follow the Messiah. And similarly, there's a source of imagining the questions will be asked after our death up in heaven. Because as an aside, Judaism believes in an afterlife, it also believes in a heaven, and concomitantly, it does believe in a hell. We can talk about that in more detail another time. These questions were to be asked include, did you act faithfully in matters of business? In other words, as you look at the course of your life, were you the sort of person whose word was your bond? Did you sign contracts and stick with them? When you walked into a store and realized you had bought something and they hadn't charged you, did you go back in and pay? When you were part of helping to build this hyper-connected information economy in which we live today, did you think seriously about the ethics of both your own business, of your clients, of your customers, and of every community involved? That's one question we're to be asked in heaven. Another question is, did you set aside time for Torah? In other words, did you make an effort to learn and deepen your spiritual and ethical self so that you could act more wholly and completely in the world? I know in my own life that the study of Talmud has deepened my understanding of the power of words and language. It's helped instruct me to use words that move away from division and destruction and towards healing and wholeness. And I couldn't have done that without setting aside time for learning and study. The Talmud also asks a strange question. Keep in mind, this is after you're already dead and you're up in heaven, and you're going to be asked, did you yearn for the salvation? So wait a minute, I'm like waiting to be led into heaven. And the question is, did you yearn for the salvation? Because what it means to be Jewish is always to be in a posture of hope. It means to look at the world as it is and to start imagining the world as it should be every single moment of our life. We have to be yearning for the salvation. That doesn't mean we're yearning necessarily for the Messiah. It means we're yearning for the world to become the world as it needs to be and should be. And that we need to do to be let in to heaven, says the Talmud. The third, I won't say final, the third paradox I'll bring up today about Yom Kippur is that we invest a great deal in rituals of the body in order to create a change in our spirit. We're fasting, we're dressing in symbolic clothes. In other words, we're trying to do things to our body so that something inside ourselves will be transformed and changed. We understand that mitzvot can have the power, when we choose to invest them, to put us into harmony with the divine. That the purpose of these commandments is to get our body moving in the right way, to help us begin to channel God's energy so that we can start to see the world as it is supposed to be and become God's partner in affecting it. But the rabbis teach, Hakol b'yadei shamayim chutz miyirat shamayim. Everything is in God's hands except for piety. Meaning God can't make the fast be meaningful. That's something that we have to do ourselves. You know, I learned a few years ago that there are people who started printing a t-shirt that said, I survived the fast at Yom Kippur. I'm not making this up. So look, I like funny things. It's very funny. Okay? But it's exactly what the fast isn't supposed to be. It's not a showing of machismo. It's not some kind of Jewish survival ritual. It's instead a practice that's meant to open up our heart and expand our consciousness so that we want to do good in the world. So we're trusting a physical ritual to introduce for us an internal change. The prophet Isaiah today is addressing these paradoxes and these challenges in his beautiful words and poetry. As I mentioned earlier in interrupting Seema, where'd she go sit? Thank you, Seema. By the way, we'd set up very carefully which verses I was going to interrupt. Then I lost the card. So actually she was being interrupted, so I'm grateful for your open-heartedness. But I guess of all days to be forgiving, this seems like maybe the day. So imagine 2,700 years ago, they're in not the second temple, but the first temple, about which we know very little. And they're engaged in the rituals of Yom Kippur. Maybe they've done the offering. How many people here are Levites? Your ancestors are up on the bima and they're singing beautifully. And it's a high moment and everybody's feeling the majesty and the august quality. And then there's some guy in a white robe in the back. And he says, Solu, Solu, Panu Derech. Clear a road. Get out of my way. I need to get up to the front. And something about, I don't know, the intensity of his message, the power of his eyes, something, they can't stop him. And he walks up to the bima and he hijacks the ceremony at its most sacred moment. And he says, God is El Ram V'Nisa Shochenad. God is the Most High who inhabits eternity. And you think God's here. But I got news for you. God is found with the impoverished, with the brokenhearted, with the depressed. That God is so well interested precisely in being with people who feel at the lowest point in their life. You know, I learned during the pandemic, when we were shut down, that there are many people who are invisible to us, including among them some immigrants, both legal and illegal, who do a lot of the day laboring, unskilled work that's around us all the time. They're the people who take care of our yards. They're the people who clean our dishes in restaurants. They do day laboring jobs and all other kinds of work. Some of them also were skilled laborers who've been trained in various professions, and they're also the ones putting in electricity and glass and other kinds of skilled work. And we mostly don't even see them. And when the pandemic hit and all that kind of work shut down, many people found themselves without an ability to pay their rent. And so a group of us got together from Kolamet to try to help at least a little bit, to plant at least one tree before the Messiah would arrive to try to help a few people. And I learned something that I didn't know. Many of those day laborers and unskilled workers don't live in an apartment. They're renting a couch or a piece of floor or a little cot, and that's where they go every night to sleep. And when the world shut down, they lost the ability to pay even for that little bit of floor on which to sleep, for that lumpy couch that they were used to going to bed in. And those apartments were meant to be emptied out during the day, became overcrowded during the shutdown. So we tried to help at least a little bit, and we raised actually tens of thousands of dollars to help provide some assistance in being a gap until things reopened again. But those people are still living, sleeping on couches and on floors. And I have news for you. I believe that God is located in every pad and every couch and in every room that's overcrowded with people who don't have anywhere else to go. And if we want God to be in this beautiful, august space, and Stan, you did a great job. If we want God to be here, we have to open our eyes up to those locations as well. We have to let those invisible workers become visible to us. We have to be upset that there's people who all they have to sleep on is a lumpy couch. The prophet continues. I should say a word about prophecy versus rabbinic work. The job of a rabbi is to be a comforting and loving presence. It's to be with you at moments of joy and at moments of sadness. I realized somewhere in the mid part of my career what an incredible thing it is that people invite me to all these parties. I get invited to weddings and brisses and all kinds of celebrations, and it's amazing that people want me to be with them while they celebrate, and maybe give me a little cake too. And it's my job maybe to teach a little bit of Torah and help guide and be present with the community. The prophet's job is to accuse and to make uncomfortable and to challenge you and to have you see that it's not enough what you've been doing. So Isaiah goes on and he says, listen, I recognize that you are self-centered and you're paying attention only to your own needs. You've shown up here on Yom Kippur and you're fasting and you're engaging in all these practices and prayers, and you're sitting here and you're saying what a burden it is to sit in this chair for hours and have the rabbi keep saying, get up, sit down. And you think, where is God in all of this? Because I was trained professionally to tell you when to sit and when to stand. And I know, says the prophet, that the truth is you're just or more worried about your own business. I know some of you snuck out and looked at your email. I know there are people who've checked the news or want to see what their stock market portfolio is looking like in this time of crazy volatility, and you're doing it right now. That's not the fast I desire, says the prophet. I would never say that. And he says, what is the fast that I desire? God wants to know. The fast I desire is a fast that expands our heart and opens our eyes to suffering and challenge all around us, that frees those who have been imprisoned, that invites the hungry to our own table. I mentioned earlier, there are 250,000 people in Santa Clara County who go to bed every night without knowing where all their calories the next day are coming from. You and I fast voluntarily once a year, some of us maybe a few more times over the year. And I know exactly where my next meal is coming from because it's ready in my fridge even now. We need to open up our eyes and see and do something about those 250,000 people who are hungry. We need to realize and remember that the whole world around us is crying out in its brokenness, that we need to care for this planet with love and with compassion. And the prophet is saying, if you ignore the poor, and if you ignore the needy, and if you ignore the earth, then a day of reckoning is coming, and you're not going to like it. But there is hope. And the hope comes in recognizing that we can open our hearts to those who are in need. We can begin to notice in Israel that there are young people who, because they grew up as maybe Sephardi or Yemenites, that because maybe they were in an underdeveloped area outside the Jerusalem-Tel Aviv corridor, that they never had the kind of educational opportunities that an Ashkenazi Israeli would have had. And they serve nevertheless in the military, and they go up just like everyone or even more. Because the truth is, if you want to talk about a prophetic rant, there are people in the coffee houses of Tel Aviv who every year avoid the draft. And I'm not kidding about that. This is a thing. In certain wealthy families, they just sort of avoid it and don't actually serve. But the people in those developing towns, they go and they serve. And when they finish their military duty, we are going to try and help some of those people go through college, because we can't do everything, but at least we can plant one tree. We can identify one underprivileged Israeli and help them be the first generation in their family to go to college and open up educational and other opportunity to a whole family and to a whole region. That is the fast that God desires. And Isaiah says, listen, you need Shabbat and holidays, and you need to make time for them in your life. I think about what happens here on Shabbat, what it means that Shabbat is a feel of the Messianic era, Me'en Olam Haba. It's on Shabbat that we give ourselves time to breathe. It's on Shabbat where we make time to sing with people and to pray and to sit in community, maybe to have some games. We often play cards. We play, I don't know, I should admit this, Carol. One of our Shabbat customs is to play cribbage sometime on Saturday afternoon. And just to have time to rest and be together with people that we love, to shut off our electronics and to let our heart expand. And you need it, because this is the only way to fulfill what Isaiah is asking us. By dedicating a day to God, we remind ourselves that it's not all about us. You know, in America, says the prophet, we can be very self-centered. Did you notice about a week ago, there was this terrible flood in Florida, and it was terrible. Dozens of people died. There were billions of dollars of destruction. It was terrible. It needed to be covered. But I don't completely understand why it crowded out what was happening in Ukraine or some of the other disasters around the world that are frankly of much greater import. We got so focused on what's happening in our own neighborhood that we forgot for a week to think about what's going on in the rest of the world. We run the risk always of looking too much at our navel and forgetting about those who are in need and those who are suffering all around us every day. There's a story told by the rabbis of a figure named Choni HaMa'agal, Choni the circle maker. He was known to be in harmony with the divine. He was so deeply in contact with God that he could actually force the Holy One to do things. So once there was a terrible drought, he drew a circle around himself. This is a Talmudic story, I kid you not. He said to God, I'm not getting out of this circle until you bring the rains. And the rains came, because he was Choni HaMa'agal. So the last story of his life, he was traveling around the countryside, and he saw an old man in his 70s. Forgive me. The Talmud actually says Zakein Shivim, right? An old man in his 70s, planting a tree. And he says, why are you doing this? What's the point? You'll never be able to eat the fruit of this beautiful orange tree sapling that you're planting. And as many of us know, the man says, you know, people planted trees for me. My parents and grandparents made sure I would have oranges and other things to eat, and so I can do no less for my children. So Choni was perplexed. He continued on his way, and he ate a light meal, and then fell asleep. And because it's a rabbinic legend, he slept for 70 years. And when he woke up, he was startled, as you can imagine, and looked around, and he saw that that sapling had now become a beautiful orange tree, fruitful and rich. And he saw an old man in his 70s picking and harvesting fruit from that very tree. And he went to him and he said, I'm so confused. Tell me, I just saw this tree as a sapling. What's going on? And he said, my grandfather planted this tree for me, and now I'm harvesting oranges for my children and grandchildren so that we can remember and love our grandfather, great-grandfather, and great-great-grandfather. And Choni was stunned. Now we think when we read this story that it's Choni who's the hero, because he's the only one named. But the hero of the story is the man who planted the tree, because Choni's already in harmony with the divine. He's already perfected himself, and there's no doubt in his mind of what he needs to do. But the old man doesn't know. He's making a leap of faith, and he's choosing to believe in his children and grandchildren and in a future that may or may not come. And in the Talmud that lives with stories of destruction and loss and instability, it is an amazing act of faith to say, I will plant this tree here, and my children and grandchildren will eat from it. I will at least do one thing to make the world better, and it will give to my family. So my friends, it's time for us to start planting trees. And in some ways, I mean that literally. Last year, our Leolam Va'ed committee encouraged us to plant trees around the world to donate to help fight against deforestation. And so we actually planted 11,000 trees from Kolamet. I'll let you know when you're up for watering. This year, they're challenging us to plant 36 trees per family, which would be about 18,000 trees from the Kolamet community. And when we join ourselves to other people of faith and other communities, we are fighting against the problem of deforestation and making the possibility of cleaner air, of fighting against the dangers of fires, and really trying to heal our state and the whole world in that very simple act of literally planting a tree. You might know also that there are people who live just a few miles from here in neighborhoods like East Palo Alto or Willow Glen. And because they live in those neighborhoods, the air that they breathe is substantially less clean than the air that you and I typically are breathing. And in fact, the risk of asthma goes up from 17% in the rest of the surrounding communities to 50% in those underprivileged neighborhoods. That means half of the people who live in East Palo Alto or Willow Glen are suffering from asthma because the quality of the air is so bad. So there is a group of us trying to buy air purifiers, to at least plant a little tree to make a difference in something that we can do and help people right now be able to breathe cleaner air with all of the promises of health and education and well-being that promises. This fast is meant to open up our eyes and our hearts to the suffering in the world around us. It's meant to challenge us to realize that we need to change who we are as people and open up our eyes. We have to see the invisible workers. We have to see when we drive tonight. It's got to change us. You guys are going to leave here and you're going to be just the same as you came in. And here's how I know, says the prophet, because I wouldn't say this. Here's how I know. You're going to drive out and you're going to be exactly the same. You're going to look at the news. You're going to ignore the brokenhearted person in front of you. You're not even going to see somebody who's leaving looking sad and upset. And heaven forbid you should notice the RVs that are lining El Camino and Park Avenue and so many other streets. You're not even going to see it because you're exactly the same as you left. To change means to open up our eyes and to actually see. There's on a street near mine, there was a unmarked van parked, a blue unmarked van that was parked for a few weeks. And this is actually a different one than the one I mentioned to you earlier. This van is parked there, and somebody put a note on the van, please move your van, because it was ugly. But I think there was a family of 3 living in the van. I saw a little kid in there. I definitely saw a dad and a little kid. I'm not sure if there was a mom or not living in the van. They put a sign, move your van. And then they called the police on them and they put a tow sign, we're going to tow your vehicle. And now I don't know where the van is. It moved somewhere else as we keep moving these vehicles all around town and all around our county because nobody wants them in their own neighborhoods. And this fast is meant to tell us not just that we're going to try and do something, but that our streets maybe are open. It says invite the hungry in to break bread with you. That means to say you can park here. And that means to say we're going to start planting the trees that we can plant to make a real difference in the world around us. So listen, my friends, hope is not lost because the whole point of the fast is to realize that we can change and open our eyes and uncover our compassion. And so I hope that this fast can change us, that we can start to see the invisible workers, that we can start to notice with empathy and sympathy people who are living in RVs. Our heart can be expanded to the challenges and brokenness in the world around us. We realize we want to help an Israeli soldier go to college, and then God can say, this is the fast that I desired. Gamar Chatima Tova, may we all be sealed for a good year.